Welcome, everybody, and to those who are also watching us online, welcome. We're glad you're able to be with us tonight. We're going to start with a song. What's our first song, Anna Faye? The Church is One Foundation. What's that number in case anybody wants the music? 545, or the words will be on the screen. So we have with us tonight Lisa Wolf, and come on up. And Lisa, there's a mic here on this chair, and Lori Walkie. And Lisa, were you raised in the United Methodist Church? Is that right? Yes. She was, and then she at some point switched to the UCC, so we can definitely relate to that, and she can relate to what we're going through. And Lori went to OSU, so I'm very excited about that, and she played basketball at OSU. But she's been the associate at Mayflower for several years, and she's now the senior pastor at Mayflower. And Lisa teaches at Oklahoma City University. Is Hebrew Scriptures your area of expertise?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Okay.
So we have taken the past 5 weeks to talk about the United Church of Christ because Jenny, our over there, and I took an online course through Phillips. And Jenny bowed out on the final project, but I plunged ahead and did this 50-page final on putting together, if I was to teach a class on the UCC. They wanted us to put that together. So we've covered a little bit of the history and theology, the polity, the ministry side, and then the ethos last week. Why don't you guys just give us a little bit of more background about yourself, and then every week they've asked me questions, and I said, that's a very good question. We'll ask Lori and Lisa when they get here. So just tell us a little bit more about yourself that you'd like us to know. It doesn't have to be long while they're kind of thinking about their questions.
So I grew up United Methodist, except for about a little handful of years, in my earliest years, we went to, yeah.
If you're comfortable taking your mask off,
Oh,
it would be
sure.
helpful. Some
Okay.
people do kind of read lips, and
I teach with it on, so.
it's kind of
I'm
muffled
used
a
to
little
it,
bit
but-
too, so
Yeah, okay.
if you're comfortable doing that. Sorry to put you on the spot like that.
So my family actually went to a congregational church for a short period of time when I was very young, and then we switched to United Methodist Church. So I grew up United Methodist. I went to United Methodist Church camp. I took all of the United Methodist classes in seminary. I went to United Methodist Seminary. I got the scholarships, and then I got ordained UCC. A little bit longer story there that I'll excerpt out for now, but I can go back to it if needed. And proceeded to get ordained in the UCC, and now have served almost my whole career in United Methodist institutions. And I teach theological education for United Methodists. Most of my undergraduates are United Methodists. So I think what I bring uniquely is the points of comparison. I taught UCC history and polity when I was in Ohio. I'm not as familiar with the UCC in this part of the country. I'm not as familiar with a lot of things that Lori brings, like more active in the UCC of late. So, yeah, I got the mojo going on.
Lisa also has 2 children who've have been involved in our youth group that we do combined with Open Arms and Cathedral of Hope. So I've enjoyed getting to know, especially her son, who's been coming for over a year, I think, and then her daughter just started coming this summer. So
Whose line is, "Why didn't I let you talk me into this sooner?"
that's great.
Yeah, yeah.
And he went to, she went to church camp, didn't she?
She went to Camp Spark.
Yeah, she went to
Yes.
Camp Spark along with other.
almost entirely staff who were my former students of
Yes.
the past 14 years, so that was lovely.
Yes. And we did trivia 2 weeks ago, and one of the questions was name a professor in the religion department at OCU, which happened to go to the team that had her 2 kids on it, and they were the only ones that knew the answer to that email.
I'm glad they
Parenting
knew.
So Lori, tell us just a little bit about yourself.
So just so I understand this, Pastor Scott took a polity course, and now everyone is being punished.
Yes.
That's that's what happened.
The attendance got smaller and smaller until tonight, and now they've all come back.
Excellent. That's how Lisa and I planned it. Well, I want to start by saying, just acknowledging that this conversation is probably painful for many of you. And I say that having had to leave the denomination that raised me. And while that may not be the end result for this congregation, I know that just having this conversation is difficult. I was raised very Southern Baptist, and I was going to be a very excellent Southern Baptist preacher's wife. Except that the church didn't really raise me to be a pastor's wife. The church raised me, the faithful people that raised me to be a pastor. They just did not realize that. And so I am a UCC transplant. And Lisa's sort of reference, like, I was this, and then I was UCC. And there's like the comma, and in the UCC we have a saying that never place a period where God has placed a comma, because there's a lot of story in those commas, and that is true for me as well. The really shortened version is that when I met my husband, he was a member at Mayflower already, and so for the first 6 months of us dating, we would go to the early service at Mayflower, where I was exposed to progressive theology that I had never heard before, but made much more sense and aligned with my experience of God and other people. And then we would go to the very small Southern Baptist congregation where I was serving as the pianist on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights, and was hearing the theology that I had grown up with. And that's how I know that Colin really loved me, because he endured that for 6 months before I was finally like, okay, we can't do this anymore. But it was in the UCC where I first was told that God indeed calls women and has since the beginning to pastoral ministry, and that the church actually encourages and celebrates the ordination of women. It was minorly inconvenient that I was in the middle of law school when I discovered this, but upon finishing law school and passing the bar exam, I went to seminary at Phillips Theological Seminary, where I met all kinds of very faithful people. But that's actually where I first started taking religion courses, because I didn't need to take religion courses in college because Southern Baptists know their stuff already. So it's fine. But was ordained in 2012 and have been in parish ministry since then, and went back to Candler to get my my doctor of ministry, and that's how I.
Also in Methodist school.
Also a Methodist. Just y'all are everywhere, and so that's sort of a little bit of background. But I strongly identify with being raised by very loving, very faithful people with whom I have deep theological differences with, but for whom I wouldn't be a minister without.
Thank you. If you have any questions, we put a mic there in the middle, if you wouldn't mind going to the mic, and that way it would just save me from running around. And it was not on my idea to do that, but I'm thankful for that. But any questions? I know you all have questions. Don't make a liar out of me.
No, UCC does
mic.
not stand
Come
for
to the mic, Mike.
Unitarians considering Christ.
Is it
I
on?
say-
Jeff,
I say
is it
that.
on? Okay.
And I have a list of talking points, so if,
We could quiz them if you want, now that we've been
I also have
learning.
a whole bag of books because I believe that every situation needs a book.
Yes.
So.
Do I
amen.
believe that
Amen and
too,
amen.
y'all?
Yes, he does.
Pull the mic up all the way so you can.
Sure. I was just wanting to see if I could ask since you each have a different perspective on this, but yet have connections to the United Methodist Church, what would you think we would like to hear as far as the largest differences that one would expect? So if we decided to switch to UCC denominational church.
Well, I think one of the most significant differences is the relationships and the connection that the local church has with the wider denomination or even the conference. The denomination speaks to us, but not for us. And that's, I think, a pretty significant difference. One of the things that we say quite often, for better or for worse, in the UCC is that if you've been to one UCC church, you've been to one UCC church. And if you were to attend worship on any given Sunday in any of just the 4 UCC congregations in like this 2 square miles, actually, you'd have very different experiences. I will say most of the UCC congregations in this area have the same theological commitments as far as being open and affirming, but a lot of people don't realize, or some people who have been to an open and affirming congregation in the UCC, they don't realize that that is not the law of the land in the UCC. Each congregation gets to vote on issues like that. The national level provides us with support, really great marketing campaigns, things like that. They do issue statements and declarations and give opinions, but the local church really decides whether or not they adopt those positions. And that's a pretty significant, I think that's a pretty significant difference, and is sometimes really great and also sometimes really frustrating. I'll pause there and.
Now, I want to throw in just one thing, and I don't want to correct you. When I took the class and I used the term level, the professor said we don't really have levels because that implies hierarchy. And I talked a little bit about that because we definitely have hierarchy in the United Methodist Church, but my professor talked about the settings.
Yes, the national setting, or the national context, or the national offices.
But say a
Yes.
little bit more about how that really plays out. What does that mean that you don't have hierarchy and that you have settings?
Right. It's again this, the best way I feel like I can explain it is to say again that the local church is the highest authority. So very often we have new members, the local church decides who they hire and who they fire and where they send their money. That is all in the local church context. We are in relationship in our conference, and there are conferences all over the United States. We are in the Kansas-Oklahoma conference of the UCC, and so we are in real close relationship with all the UCC churches in Oklahoma and Kansas. And the conference level is actually where ministers hold their standing, which is their authority to do ministry in the name of the United Church of Christ. So ministers have to be in good standing. And that is one place where the local church doesn't have total and complete say. A minister's standing can be pulled, and they're not supposed to do ministry in the name of the UCC. But other than that, the local church really does have say over what it does and does not do, what it does and does not affirm. And then, obviously, all of the conferences are form the network of the national network or the national setting. And we have officers at in the national setting, and they do the business of the church. The wider church is a phrase we use very often. You want to supplement that, Lisa?
So when I was teaching UCC History and Polity in Ohio, most of my students were former United Methodists, or they were hoping to be formerly United Methodist and hoping to become UCC clergy. So this task of comparing specifically United Methodist to UCC is not only personal to me, but it was something they were all curious about. And one of the mantras really for any UCC History and Polity teacher is, Jesus Christ is the head of the church. Sorry, I thought I turned off my ringer. Gosh.
I thought she was going for a book.
So,
Wait for it.
Sorry about that. So Jesus Christ is the head of the church. What that means to United Methodists, no bishops. And that's what it meant the United Church of Christ has more than four main predecessor denominations. And some of them were more hierarchical, but they came together over the desire for unity, everything else aside. And so I would often tell my students, if you get into trouble or get stuck in your ordination interview, the correct answer always is, Jesus Christ is the head of the church.
Amen.
And but I think to United Methodists, that has a very specific subtext, which is there are no bishops. So that's to the hierarchy point. And I think, one of the things that's always been really clear to me is that denominational affiliation matters more for clergy than it does for lay people in a lot of ways, but not in all. And to Lori's point about what authority does the UCC have, my standard, bottom line answer for that was, if a local church hires a pastor who is not authorized in the UCC, they will get a stern letter from the denominational body, the association or the conference, whatever it is geographically, from that minister saying, I hope you've been able to find insurance and make sure it is in good order, because we will no longer back you. So that's that's it.
Brass tacks, yeah.
So authorization is a really big part of the most power that the denomination has, and it's not that much power. So really we use words like being in covenant together, and being in relationship, and speaking to and not for, and that kind of thing. So I think that the diversity within the denomination that Lori mentioned is important to know. When I was teaching UCC history and polity, and that was 15 plus years ago, most of my students were leaning much more progressive than the United Methodist Church, and that's why they wanted to come to the UCC. And the thing that was hard for me in teaching them was in looking around and thinking, there aren't enough of these churches for you. And so that's a thing. And, you know, I know there are some people with clergy standing in this congregation besides Scott. So that's a thing to think about, is what are the implications there for clergy? Not that it's impossible to get standing in the UCC by any means, but, and I felt very welcomed, certainly one of the reasons I came. But I think in the United Methodist Church, most United Methodist clergy don't ever have to worry about being unemployed because you have a guaranteed appointment. I mean, I've learned over the years it's not always all that guaranteed, but it's mostly that. And in the UCC, I've had colleagues who've gone for years with searching for a congregation. So that's a risk, you know, that's a different thing. And same with congregations. When you lose a clergy person for one reason or another, you have to go through that decision-making process. There are times that, I mean, definitely times that UCC churches wish they had a DS. And you don't. It's on you. You have help, for sure. You do have help. And in a way, churches really are in a great position right now because I think there's a flood of clergy who are looking. There are many places in the country right now where there are no full-time clergy positions in that conference in any UCC. Mm-hmm. So I think it does affect clergy and congregations quite differently. I think that the connectionalism in the United Methodist Church and the size of the denomination is something that I miss, and except I don't miss it that much because I still get to enjoy it through working at OCU and our partnership with Mosaic and Open Arms. The denomination is a lot smaller, and it's a lot smaller here than it was in Ohio, where I came into the UCC. And so what there is of connectionalism is kind of minimal sometimes. And so I'm grateful that way that in the UCC we have a lot of freedom to build bridges with other groups. But so, I mean, one thing that came to my mind, because it happened to me last summer, was church camp. We don't have a church camp in Oklahoma. And that doesn't mean it can't happen. In fact, I have a good friend from Ohio who his UCC congregation banded together with some other UCC congregations and created a wonderful, amazing, innovative church camp that just was so sustaining for a fairly small geographical area of, actually it wasn't just UCC, it was also some American Baptist congregations who got together to do that. So there's the freedom to innovate and to be creative and to collaborate and do things that people aren't going to tell you you can't do them, and they'll probably even help you do them, but it's not automatically there. And I think especially in Oklahoma, I think that was something that really took me by surprise when I moved from Ohio UCC, where there's tons of UCC churches, even on 2 blocks in the same city because of the predecessor denominations, to Oklahoma, where it is so minimal. So I think that's a thing to be aware of.
I want to just ask you, and you might want to piggyback on this, but even though there's a lot of local control, it's congregational, but you mentioned having the backing. You said that if you don't hire a pastor with standing, then you said make sure you have insurance, you're not going to have our backing. So what does that backing mean in terms of local churches having a lot of local control, but yet there's backing? What does that practically look like?
Well, the Committee on Ministry is, I mean, a pretty powerful force within the conference. And that's the group with the power to authorize people for ministry, to interview them, to so the conference doesn't ordain, the local church ordains, but the conference authorizes the person to be ordained by the local church when they are called. And in doing that, it gives them some legal, this is where your
Yay, church.
JD
I was just
can
thinking, yay,
help.
church. Isn't that clear?
But it gives the church some legal backing that a denomination can say, yes, we have authorized this person. There are definitely congregations that hire clergy who are not authorized in the UCC. I knew a number of them in Ohio and Kentucky that did that. And usually they left the denomination shortly after that and closed their doors usually also. So it's a legal thing, and it's also part of that covenantal thing, because then the denomination is able to say, because we've authorized you, you are in active covenant with us. So I, as an authorized minister in Kansas-Oklahoma Conference, turn in my reports every year and say what I've been doing, and need to keep active to some extent and in touch and that kind of thing. And in turn, then they support congregations and they support clergy, and when necessary, will do investigations or interventions or whatever might be required.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Anna Fay. I grew up in the Congregational, then UCC, and I remember the call time as being very difficult in the congregation. Would you describe what it's like now?
And by call time, you mean seeking a new pastor, right? Yeah, that's good church language, the call.
So
Search
having-
and call.
The call.
Search and call. So having recently been through that myself, there is a process for search and call. And both ministers and local churches, congregations, have profiles that they put together, and as part of our national search and call process, so that that
It's a
is
lot
one
harder,
way.
yeah.
Yes.
We can make an app.
And so it's intended to offer a little more transparency for both a minister and a congregation, because those documents have to be approved by the conference minister, has to review the church document, and ministers are required to do a number of things, including a background check, so the church doesn't actually have to worry about that. It's just part of a minister's profile. So while there is a process, it is also open to the independence of the local congregation that kind of navigates that, how they will. So many churches, that's a phrase we use, or we use the words many and some a lot in the UCC. We hardly ever use all and none. So many congregations will have exactly what y'all have probably experienced at one point or another in your church life, a search committee. And they will gather the profiles of ministers, go through those. They'll be generally usually best practice is that they'll be in consultation with the conference minister to help them kind of figure out what they want, what direction they want to do. If there's candidates that the conference minister thinks would be especially fitting for that congregation, they'll suggest those candidates. For instance, in my case, if there's an internal candidate, like they're with Mayflower, the process is that the internal candidate would be interviewed first, and the process would not open up to everyone else until the internal candidate had been decided yay or nay on. And then the highest authority in the congregation is the congregation. So the hiring a minister requires a congregational vote, unless the local church's constitution said something different. Although on this particular issue, I haven't actually heard of any UCC churches letting just like a church council or smaller body vote on that. So that's
I think one thing I'd add is I was also trained as an interim minister when I entered the UCC, because that's a good kind of feather to have in your cap for in-between times. And an interim minister is especially trained to help a church walk through the search and call process, develop their profile, kind of work on their issues, come in there to say, I am not here to stay, so I'm going to be willing to tell you things that might offend you, but prepare you to be a good congregation for your next pastor and help you make the right choices about what to put in your profile so that you can call the right pastor, help you put together your search committee. And different conferences hold that interim ministry or interim minister role in different levels of esteem. But for the most part, churches will use an interim as a way to let them process their grief of having someone gone, because often the tenure of a pastor in the UCC is much longer than it would be in the United Methodist Church, and then help them look forward to where are we going, because it is the congregation. We're not hiring somebody to come tell us where to go. Nobody's going to send us someone who's going to tell us where to go. We need to know where we're going to go, and then based on that, our profile, we'll be able to call a good person. So I was an interim minister for about a year before I started teaching, and then that church during that time started their search and call process, and the association minister was able to help us with that. So I think it can be tense and unnerving. It sometimes can bring out, it definitely can bring out conflict in a congregation. I mean, that's something that I found when I was serving as an interim, and I've seen that in other places where you have some people who are kind of hoarding power in a congregation, who are going to position themselves to be on the search committee and make sure that they get in the person who they want, who's going to fit this profile. And so hopefully, whether it's an interim minister or it's an association or conference minister, somebody will be able to help intervene in those kinds of situations so that they can go through a healthy process. That's sort of the interim minister is sort of the wellness coach, is the idea. But it can be lengthy and it can be difficult, and the process of having an interim minister can be dicey, because like with me, I was there for a year, I got an offer to teach, I really wanted to do that. They didn't have a new pastor yet, so they had to get another interim pastor. And so it can be difficult at times. Those are the times that sometimes congregations would go, oh, gee, I wish we had a DS now to just solve this for us.
Yeah, I think in the Methodist Church, this is happening, or at least being talked about more. It can't happen with every church because it wouldn't be practical. You know, we've got 500 churches in Oklahoma, but the idea of a church being large enough or unique enough that if a pastor's been there 10 or 15 or 20 years, there's more and more talk about that church having like an interim for a year. That would be a kind of a buffer almost between that person and the next person, because there's always probably, that pastor's probably beloved, and then there's issues, and so a person in between, you know, can kind of ease that. So that, but that doesn't, we don't see that practically happening a lot, but it is talked about. Sometimes it just happens because the next person can't live in the shadow of that pastor, right? So they only last a year, maybe 2 years, and then they're gone, right? And that's sort of an interim without being an interim, right? But the interim is being talked about more among United Methodists. So for those of you we've never heard of that, you know, we've never. The other thing, though, about
I need to step out just real quick.
That's
I
fine.
have a minor
That's fine.
family emergency,
And,
perhaps.
the other
going
thing
on.
about that, as most of us probably know, if we've been around, well, if you've been around a lot of churches, you know that sometimes we sort of expect, yeah, we get a pastor, but we can kind of outlive the pastor, right? This pastor's going to be here 2 or 3 years.
You can outlast
They're
the
going to be
pastor.
here 2 or 3 years. And believe it or not, somebody told me once, I'll be here when you're gone. So they were unhappy with me, and they said, I'll be here when you're gone. So that was, yeah, I know it's hard to believe. I know it's shocking, but not everybody likes me. But I think that we sort of have that mentality of like, well, after 2 or 3 years, this pastor's going to move on. So now, if you've been in a church where you've had lengthy pastors, maybe you've not experienced that, but that does happen, I think, a lot in our system. So, how many of y'all have questions? Because we're going to run out of time. So, okay, Jenny, why don't you jump up there and take?
I think Lisa touched on my question. It's because I have so much angst around the deep conflict, the vicious conflict that's going on in the United Methodist Church. And she alluded to the Committee on Ministry. Is that where you would go to seek if there is a deep conflict in a congregation? Is that the process that you go through? Because I don't anticipate this community doing that, but I kind of want to know there's a way that happens, because it's right now we're just having such a bad experience.
Certainly at the conference level, there is advice and support. And that's actually also true in the national setting. So if a committee on ministry, a local committee on ministry, a conference committee on ministry has a question that they are wrestling with, they will go to our national offices and ask, what do we do here? That's where we get our, we even have a book of worship.
You have what? Oh.
A book of worship.
Now, wait a minute. David Wheeler told me that no one knows what that is.
That is correct.
I've got a copy of the Book of Worship in my car if you want.
It's true.
It's
it
what?
really is true. It's geographically, if you were to go to churches in Ohio or really on the east in New England, they are much more, way more proper than we are. Like, that's just what it is. They are more proper than we are.
So they use the Book of Worship.
High liturgy.
Yes.
Even, yeah. Mhm.
Yes.
So what were you saying? You said call a national.
So there's support at the national setting, but the conference does provide it can provide support to the local church through the Committee on Ministry, but also through the conference minister, and they can work with a church on conflict resolution. They ultimately cannot tell the local church what they have to do. But particularly, and I want to say this, we keep talking about like if there's like a rogue minister or something, but also if a church is being abusive, they also can be, held to account. But that's also, when people think of authorization from the conference level, they most often think of discipline or fitness reviews of a pastor.
I suppose I should have told you we are live streaming, so just FYI. Other questions? Yes. Just thought you might want to know that before you say something you don't want out there.
So could one of you clarify?
Step closer to the mic.
Could one of you clarify what an investigation or questions of abuse look like in the context of covenant?
In the context of
Covenant.
covenant.
I think in a worst-case scenario, what the conference could do is pull somebody's credentials, a clergy person's credentials, and then the local church would be in that same dilemma I mentioned before of getting the stern letter saying you're being served by a pastor who does not have the backing of the denomination, and so you need to either get your insurance in good order and make sure you can find somebody who will insure you, or you need to find a different pastor and let this one go. But that's the most they could do. That would be the closest they could come to firing your pastor, the denomination, that is. Maybe that doesn't answer your question.
Okay, that's part of the question. And then the other question that I have related to that is, do congregations misbehave or need to be held into account or whatever?
No.
Well, of course congregations misbehave. Of course. Family systems are fraught. And every single church has a family system. And that is I don't have a specific example of how that worked out. What I would do if I were having real conflict with my congregation or with the church council is I would call our conference minister and start working with our committee on ministry. There are several committee on ministries that are really in the weeds, like Committee A and Committee D, and they all stand for things, right? We like our acronyms in the UCC just as much as any denomination. But that's how that we would go first to the conference level to get advice.
So does the conference or the assembly or whatever it is, would they ever come to a church to say, you all need to shape up?
It would be possible for the conference minister to come, and the bully pulpit is real, and there would be probably some y'all need to shape up, but there's not like the conference minister or the conference couldn't say y'all are going to close your doors.
Okay, thank
And
you.
they would
And
come, and they would come at an invitation, right?
They would have to
They're not
be
just going to
invited.
walk in.
No.
Yeah.
Right?
They would have to be
In the same
invited.
way, our DS is not going to just
Right.
walk in. A DS is going to come at an invitation.
I mean, so the worst case scenario in that instance is that the church decides, or the clergy person decides that they have to leave the church. And if, so that could have a domino effect if the clergy person says, there are problems here that I have tried these 5 ways to solve with this support and nothing has happened. I am going to either be seriously considering resigning or I'm going to be resigning. I'm letting you know that. That could prompt people in the congregation to say, okay, now how are we going to handle this? But again, the denomination cannot come in and tell the congregation to shape up or tell anybody to leave, and that can certainly be harmful. Lots of churches suffer in that way.
This is at a total different area. Methodists seem to have a lot of institutions like Oklahoma City University, hospitals, all kinds of schools, and a lot of other ministries that we support, like our apportionments. Do UCC do anything like that? Or what do you do about that?
We tend to be closely affiliated. So, I mean, I'm thinking Grinnell College and Chicago Theological Seminary are
Union.
closely affiliated
Yeah.
with the United Church of Christ, but because it's a different kind of denomination, it can't have the same kind of partnership. We definitely have missions and ministries that we support, and that's a big part of the reason that many congregations will say we're part of the denomination. But instead of apportionments, we have contributions to what we call our church's wider mission, or OCWM, and then there are percentages that go to the various levels, so the national level and the regional level and so forth. And then churches can make, of course, their own decisions about who else and what else they support. So there are fewer of those things, especially in a part of the country like here, where there are not as many churches to support them. In the East Coast, there's a lot more. I mean, Harvard originally came out of the Congregationalists, and so it really depends a lot on where you are. But today, they are all really nothing more than closely affiliated.
So how does like Open Arms or Mayflower, like how do you decide what you're going to give to the wider mission of the church? Or how is that decision made?
So Mayflower, for instance, we give 20% of all funds that are designated benevolence. So when you give to Mayflower, you can designate to 3 different areas: operating, benevolence, and communication. And anything given to benevolence cannot be used for anything else, right? Not to pay the light bills or anything like that. I mean, we can pay the light bills of other people, but not the churches. And out of that benevolence money, we give 20% of that to the conference level, which is what we consider giving to the wider church, to support the work that the conference does and its support of the national setting.
So do you say like you have a goal this year of giving so much, or is it just what comes in?
Just what comes in.
Okay.
It's 20%.
Okay.
So they meet every other month, and whatever 20% of whatever came in during the past 2 months. Some churches do that. Other churches have a set amount and say, we're going to give the conference or OCWM X amount of dollars, and it is absolutely up to the individual congregations.
Am I right that, is there not a recommended percentage of your budget, or do they still do that?
Of course, there's a recommendation.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
We have
But
lots of
every church
recommendations.
does it differently. So
Yes.
some will say X dollars, and some will say, well, only to these things, and some will say X percentage of our budget. And some conferences handle that differently than others. So some will, like make a really big deal out of their biggest givers, the supporters of OCWM, and that kind of thing. But it does make the funding of the wider church tenuous.
So I don't know the answer to this question. What ministries, like we support Skyline, that's a Methodist ministry, but it's also now like its own 501c3. What would be a UCC ministry in Oklahoma and Kansas that you would say our dollars go to support that?
Church of the Open Arms Food Pantry.
Right.
Other churches give to support that? Or that's
Yeah,
what,
sure. I
Yeah.
think Mayflower helps support
Yes,
it.
Okay.
And CSU isn't, it's its own organization. Open Arms helps.
there's not a specific though,
I think
UCC
maybe-
ministry?
No, so sometimes churches will give specifically to, I think maybe this might be more familiar.
Like we give to support the campgrounds, for the Methodist campgrounds. Do you have some, I know you don't have Methodist camps, but do you have a ministry that?
We don't have a national camp that we would do that for. We used to have Camp White, which was in Kansas, and yes,
You would
UCC
support
churches
that,
in the
okay.
KO conference would give there. Churches have the option of supporting, I don't know what the United Methodist Church calls it, but basically retired ministers or ministers who might be facing financial hardship. We have a specific fund for that. We also have a specific fund to support young ministers, a program called NGLI, Next Generation Leadership Initiative, which I think all denominations basically have now a program to convince young clergy to stay in the denomination or stay in church work, period. Let me say that. And you can give specifically to that. There are several, the UCC has a pension board, and a lot of our funds come from the pension board, come out of the pension board.
Again, geographically, when I was in Ohio, there was a little church in a rough part of Cincinnati that a lot of churches were very intentional about supporting. And in that region, because it was bigger, we had a lot more theological diversity within that conference, at least at that time. And so there were some congregations who didn't feel comfortable contributing to the national level because they disagreed with issues like LGBTQ marriage issues or ordination issues, but they would send their support money to Washington UCC, or the camp programs. There were 2 camps in Ohio when I was there that I worked with, and so that does happen in other geographical locations, but here nothing else comes immediately to mind. But I did want to mention that on a national level, denominationally, the UCC partners with the Disciples of Christ for international mission work. And so the global board, no, that's United Methodist, isn't it?
Yes.
That's
We
funny.
have studied that, but I can't remember the name of it, but there is a
Anyway, so
missions
there,
or-
so there are actually some really great international mission programs with a very progressive new understanding of what it means to do mission, I would add. And that's a partnership. So the UCC and the Disciples of Christ have had a fairly close relationship for decades, which stopped short of merging, but we do partner in a lot of ways, and we even have a mechanism that is pretty well used for more or less exchanging clergy between the denominations.
And I will also add, so the national setting handles, national efforts. So for instance, raising money for Haiti or Afghanistan, aid in Afghanistan, the national setting coordinates all of that for local churches, but the local churches have to opt in to giving on top of whatever they've already done or things like that.
When I was preaching for Lori during her sabbatical in the Haiti crisis happened, I went on ucc.org and went to donate, and I found the link, and so I knew I could say that from the pulpit, and that would be the way to get people involved in that. So that is really well in place, I think.
You raised money while Lori was gone?
Well, for Haiti.
Lacey,
So I'm not an expert on UCC polity
get
yet.
closer to the mic.
Okay, is this better? I'm not an
There we
expert
go.
on UCC polity yet. So y'all have a lot of church trials or no?
Oh, gosh, no church trials.
No church trials? Do y'all have a
No.
lot of clergy bringing up other clergy on charges?
Lacey.
No,
Do y'all have
actually,
what about like people in the congregation?
when I was drawing up my bullet points on differences between the United Methodist Church and the UCC, I thought, well, Lisa, one of the things that would be a really big change for these folks is actually a lack of conflict within the denomination.
There's no like
When-
Supreme
But-
Court?
It's not that there's no conflict.
Sure.
There is some, but frankly, even in the 15 years I've been here, most of the churches that were bringing most of the conflict to our conference meetings each year have left the denomination. And I'm not going to celebrate that because that just doesn't seem right.
Sure.
But I have also watched in the past 5 years, especially, as new congregations joined. And it is a very different ethos and tenor in those meetings than what I know. Even, I usually, when I'm at the annual conference meetings, I'm usually standing outside at the
bar,
recruiting booth.
outside the bar.
But you can still feel the tension out there. And then people walk out just because they're going to have an anxiety attack or something like that, and then they chat with you and stuff. So I think that is a definite difference. You know, there is diversity, but there is not by any means the level of conflict there currently is in the United Methodist Church.
We don't have a bar with liquor at the conference. It's a different kind of bar.
And I mean, and I agree. I think Lisa said that really well. And you know, when we say when you've been to one UCC church, you've been to one UCC church, and covenant is like our word. But there definitely is a sense that we are not going to agree on everything. And even in local congregations, I think that's true, that the person you are sitting next to in the pew is not going to believe everything that you believe, and vice versa. And I think that really has permeated the UCC. And
What's the level of acceptance? Because I would say, like here at Mosaic, we don't all believe the same thing, and we're totally cool with it. We're super into it. Is that sort of the same vibe, or?
I mean, it's so hard to say.
Sure,
It's hard
sure.
to speak for the denomination or
In your lived experience?
in my lived experience. That is true, and I say that from a person who is just a member, a lay person in the congregation, but also as a clergy with colleagues with whom we don't all agree on some theological points to worship style.
It'd be scary if you did, right?
Yeah, that would really be boring too.
I mean, I served a couple of small ones, very small one, more medium-sized, fairly rural, one suburban, kind of southern Ohio congregations. And I mean, politically, whoa, all across the board for sure. In terms of socially and theologically, I feel like there was an attitude in both of those settings, or well, there were about 4 different congregations that I served. That, you know, we come here because we're a community, and there are things we're going to disagree on. Now, the openness of the denomination, I think, helped allow them to live into their diversity. So, for instance, because they were in the UCC, they are hearing from the national setting when were passing things like marriage equality, which was a long time ago now in the UCC, or when they were talking about international issues that related to social justice and that kind of thing. And because they were part of the denomination, you know, this wide spectrum of people was in a position to engage those issues. And I think for the most part, people did a pretty good job of working through those things. I mean, one of the things that I always think about with the Christian church predecessor denomination was this word liberty of interpretation and belief. And our creeds are not a test, they're a testimony.
What does that mean?
I mean, to me, it means nobody can...
Notice she said to me.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
It means they can't ditch me if in my ordination interview I say, you know, I can't really swallow that line in the Apostles' Creed, but here's why. And I have a whole theology around that I can articulate and explain for you, and I can give you footnotes and everything. But they can't kick me out for that. But I feel like in a lot of my experiences in the UCC, there's just been this sense of relishing the ability to make those decisions congregationally and enjoying it, even when it's difficult and even painful. I worked with one little congregation, two, to talk to each other about possibly merging. And we went through a whole process together that we created together, and they had meetings and they had worship and they did different things. And in the end, they just decided we're not a good fit. And it was hard, difficult work, but it was so lovely and beautiful too. And they loved each other at the end. They just decided they weren't a good match, you know. So I think there's such an enjoyment of the decision-making process and getting to really have a hand in it.
Let me just ask real quick, who else has questions? Lacey, did you have another question? Anybody else have, we're going to run out of time, but can you say just a little extra, or just a little? Or
I'd like to add that sometimes folks that come to the UCC from more creedal traditions think, well, UCC doesn't, they don't believe anything, or you can think anything you want, you can say anything you want, and that's not true. Mm-hmm. Our congregations work to articulate particular values, and that's what I would say. That is another way that we live into creeds are not a test, but a testimony. So, you know, we recognize sacraments of baptism and communion. That doesn't mean that that's only the two sacraments that UCC churches recognize. But when we talk about baptism, we talk about that in 100 different ways. That's what testimony and not test means. Like, we don't have to ascribe to one interpretation of really any component or element of church life and doctrine.
I mean, there's no discipline to go to like look it up and go, well, what's the right answer to this question that somebody wants to be rebaptized? Well, there's lots of places you can go to look into that question, but there's not going to be paragraph 247 that'll answer it for you.
And we feel like that's what it means to live into this idea that work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Work it out.
Fear and trembling. She's quoting the Bible.
To quote Paul.
She's a former Baptist, so she's quoting the Bible.
Right?
I mean, I
know.
think he was quoting the Bible.
Do what?
He was quoting the Bible.
Right, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that is like, that's the intent. We think that that's the intent of like that particular passage. So when we talk about salvation, baptism is part of that, communion is part of that, mission and work of the church is part of that, your personal relationship and our communal body relationship. Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Take it seriously. This is sacred work.
Here's your chance for just one last question.
Does the UCC do altar calls?
I mean, no,
Some-
not as a denomination, but
When they have
It's an
commu-
option. It's not, I don't know of any specific examples. Yeah, no, and this is the answer that,
But every
some-
communion is a call to come.
oh, there are totally UCC pastors who do altar calls.
Really?
Right.
Oh,
Really?
sure. Yeah.
For
And
salvation?
congregations who would, I mean, what it would look like would vary, but yeah,
probably
there
a
are-
little more disciple-ish, I would say, like just a respond to the gospel sort of altar call versus what I am, I have walked the aisle in a salvation to accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior. And so that's not quite super common in the UCC, but there are definitely churches that encourage people to respond immediately in the worship service.
And I think it would be regional too, and depend on, that own pastor's
Their background
background.
and-
But probably my reference point there is a little dated and definitely geographical, and it may be that there's less of that now than there was 10 or 15 years ago, even in Southern Ohio.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it. I'm sure we have more questions, but that's a good for tonight. We really appreciate you guys coming. And I appreciate your comments about it's hard to think about this. Many of us are lifelong Methodists, and it is hard. So,
Yeah.
And we appreciate your hospitality and also the hospitality of your regional minister. Not the new one, but the one we got to know before. So,
Yeah.
whose name is escaping me right
Edith
now.
Guthrie.
Edith, yes. She's been very helpful to us, so, to our council. So, what are we going to sing, Anna Faye? Let there be peace. All right. So next week, we will talk just briefly about the Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and American Baptists, who I don't know hardly anything about. And then the next week, we will have Paul Calkin here and Shannon Fleck to talk about the disciples. So that's where we're headed. So thank you all for coming tonight, and I'll turn it over to the choir. All right.